November 14th, 1940. The air over Britain is cold and black. Deep within that darkness, 500 German bombers are vectoring towards a single, unsuspecting target. They are about to destroy a British city with terrifying, surgical precision. They are not guided by sight. They are not guided by maps. They are guided by invisible radio beams. Hitler's secret weapon, a technological marvel that nobody can see, nobody can detect, and nobody can stop. Except one man. A 28-year-old physicist hunched over a desk in London who looks at the impossible data and says, "I can see them." Everyone called him crazy. The military brass, men of action and steel, laughed at his impossible theoretical antenna. But what this young scientist discovered didn't just save thousands of lives, it exposed Hitler's biggest secret, a secret that, left unchecked, could have changed the entire course of the war. Our story begins a year earlier. On a cold November evening in 1939, Dr. Reginald Victor Jones sat in his cramped, borrowed office at the Air Ministry in London. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the scent of stale tea. Paperwork was stacked in teetering hazardous piles on every surface, a monument to a bureaucracy at war. Jones, a physicist by training and an intelligence officer by necessity, was staring at a decoded German message that made no sense. The 28-year-old had been recruited to British scientific intelligence just weeks earlier. His official, unassuming title was Scientific Officer, Air Ministry. His real job, however, was far more nebulous: investigate German scientific developments. He was a one-man department, tasked with imagining the unimaginable. But this message was different. It wasn't about new engine designs or armor plating. It was terrifying. The intercept mentioned something called X-Jurat, the X device. It referenced beams, coordinates, and targeting systems. It read like pure fantasy. Jones read the message again, then a third time, his hands trembling slightly. He picked up his slide rule. He ran calculations on a scrap of paper, his pencil moving furiously. If his interpretation was correct, the Germans had developed a way to bomb British cities with unprecedented pinpoint accuracy, even in complete darkness. He took his initial findings to his superiors. The reaction was not what he'd hoped for. "Radio beams, guiding bombers?" scoffed Air Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory. "Impossible. Utterly impossible. The curvature of the Earth alone would make such a system useless. You're wasting our time with science fiction, Dr. Jones." They saw him as an academic, a boffin in a rumpled suit. But Jones couldn't let it go. He returned to his office, the dismissal stinging. He'd spent the last 3 weeks collecting fragments, disparate pieces of a puzzle only he could see. There was a report from a crashed German bomber, a Heinkel He-111. The technical report mentioned unusual radio equipment, a complex receiver the RAF technicians couldn't identify. Then there were the intercepted Luftwaffe communications, vague, cryptic chatter, mentions of beams, of Nickebein, and finally the reports from RAF pilots, who'd noticed strange, steady radio signals while flying over Germany. Late that night, Jones spread everything across his desk: photographs of the crashed Heinkel's dashboard, technical diagrams, signal reports, decoded messages. Somewhere in this puzzle was the truth, and if he was right, Britain was in more danger than anyone realized. The German Luftwaffe had been bombing British cities for months, but it was a blunt, clumsy affair. British military planners assumed they were safe from precision bombing at night. But what if it did? What if the Germans had found a way around the darkness, rendering every blackout, every barrage balloon, obsolete? Jones picked up his telephone. "Charles," he said, his voice quiet but urgent, "I need you to come back to the office. I think I figured something out, something important." An hour later, the two men sat surrounded by the sea of paper. Jones stood, pacing. "What if," he began, The Germans aren't using just one beam. What if they're using intersecting radio beams? He grabbed a pencil. Look, a bomber flies along one beam. It's like a radio railroad track. He drew a long, straight line. Then, a second transmitter broadcasts another beam, a crossbeam, right above the target. He tapped the intersection with his pencil. The bomber flies along the guide beam. When its receiver suddenly picks up the signal from the second beam, the bomb aimer releases the bombs. Charles studied the diagrams. His initial skepticism melted away, replaced by a cold dread. "That's brilliant," he whispered. "Terrifyingly brilliant. But is it technically possible?" "I think it is," Jones replied quietly, looking at the technical specs from the crashed bomber. "And I think they're already using it." If Jones was right, Hitler, as Luftwaffe, was about to unleash a campaign of destruction more accurate and devastating than anything the world had ever seen. And the only thing standing between Britain and catastrophe was one young physicist with a crazy theory about radio beams. A theory that almost nobody believed. The next morning, Jones, armed with his diagrams, his calculations, and his terrifying conclusion, requested an emergency meeting with the highest levels of British military and scientific leadership. He bypassed the chain of command, a bureaucratic sin of the highest order. But this couldn't wait. He was granted 15 minutes. 15 minutes to convince a room full of skeptical generals and air marshals, men who had spent their lives studying ballistics and aircraft performance, that an invisible threat was real. The room was intimidating. It was the Air Ministry's main conference room, paneled in dark wood, dominated by a massive oak table. The air was heavy with authority. Around the table sat some of Britain's most powerful military minds. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, head of RAF Fighter Command, his face weary from the ongoing battle. Henry Tizard, the government's chief scientific advisor, a man who, like Jones, had to bridge the gap between science and war, and several senior intelligence officers, their faces impassive. They looked at the young, slightly disheveled physicist with barely concealed impatience. Jones, clutching his papers, began nervously. His voice was too quiet, too academic. "Gentlemen," he started, I have reason to believe the Germans have developed a system for precision night bombing using radio beams." The senior air marshal, Lee Mallory, sighed audibly. "Dr. Jones, we have been over this. It is science fiction. I trust you have something more concrete than last time." Jones took a deep breath. The skepticism in the room was a physical force. He had to change tactics. He wasn't a nervous academic. He was a scientist with proof. He grew more confident as he laid out his evidence, his voice gaining strength. He wasn't asking them. He was telling them. He showed them the intercepted messages. He showed them the photographs of the unidentified German equipment. He showed them the pilot reports. And most importantly, he showed them his calculations, the physics of how it could work. "Gentlemen," Jones explained, walking to a blackboard and sketching a hasty diagram. "Imagine 2 radio transmitters in Germany or in the occupied territories. Each broadcasts a narrow beam, much narrower than conventional radio. This is possible using a high frequency and a highly directional antenna." He drew 2 points on the continent and 2 lines crossing over a crude map of England. The beams intersect over a British city, let's say Coventry. A German bomber, he continued, simply flies along the first beam. When its receiver suddenly picks up the signal from the second beam, the pilot knows he is exactly over the target. They don't need to see anything. Weather doesn't matter. Darkness doesn't matter. The beams tell them exactly where they are. "Preposterous," interrupted the same senior air marshal. "Radio waves don't work that way. They spread out. They diffuse. You cannot create a narrow, stable beam over hundreds of miles." But Henry Tizard, the scientific advisor, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Jones. He had a look of keen, sudden interest. Actually, Air Marshal, Tizard said, his voice cutting through the grumbling, with the right frequency, it is theoretically possible. Highly complex, but possible. He turned to Jones. Dr. Jones, your theory is sound, but what evidence do you have that the Germans have actually built such a system? This was the moment. Jones presented his strongest piece of evidence. A German pilot, he said, a bomb aimer from a Heinkel, was shot down last week. During interrogation, he was arrogant. He boasted. He inadvertently mentioned training on a beam-flying system, one that was unerring. He caught himself too late. He clammed up after that. The room was silent. The what if had suddenly become terrifyingly real. I need resources, Jones said urgently, his voice ringing with conviction. I need aircraft, sensitive radio receivers, technical specialists, and I need permission to develop countermeasures immediately. Because, gentlemen, if I'm right, these beams aren't just a plan. They are already operational. The Germans could use them tonight. The room fell silent. The ticking of a clock on the wall was deafening. Finally, Hugh Dowding, who had said nothing, spoke. His voice was gravelly, tired. Dr. Jones, he said, fixing the young man with an intense gaze, if you're wrong about this, you will be wasting valuable resources. We desperately need elsewhere. He paused, the implication sinking in for everyone at the table. But if you're right, Dowding continued, if you are right, every British city is at risk. Every factory, every port, every airfield. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. You have your resources. Get your aircraft. Find these beams. Don't waste them. Within hours, Jones had assembled a small, eclectic team of scientists, radio specialists, and RAF liaison officers. Their mission was secret, urgent, and to many, absurd. Find Hitler, his invisible beams, and figure out how to stop them before they could be used to destroy Britain's cities. They worked out of a cramped set of rooms, wires and oscilloscopes and radio parts cluttering every table. The team worked around the clock, fueled by adrenaline and endless cups of tea. Modified RAF Avro Anson aircraft, slow but steady, were pulled from training duty. They were fitted with new, sensitive radio receivers that Jones's team had cobbled together. Their flight crews were given simple, baffling instructions. Fly these search patterns over England. You're looking for a radio signal. If you find it, don't just log it. Follow it. See where it leads. For 3 long days, they found nothing. The aircraft flew their search patterns grid by grid over the dark, blacked-out landscape of England. Their radio receivers just hissed with static. They found BBC broadcasts. They found atmospheric noise. They found military chatter. They found nothing that looked like a narrow guiding beam. Jones's critics grew louder. The pressure from the Air Ministry was immense. We're wasting time and resources on ghost hunting, complained one senior officer in a memo. Jones was at the breaking point. His career, his reputation was on the line. But worse, he knew that the beams were out there. He just couldn't find them. They must be using them intermittently, he theorized to his colleague, Charles Frank. They only switch them on for a raid or for practice. We're just not in the right place at the right time. We need to keep looking. Then, on the 4th night, everything changed. An Anson, call sign V Victor, was flying a pattern near Derby. The radio operator, a young sergeant, was tired, his ears aching from the endless static. He was about to log another empty sortie when a new signal cut through the noise. It wasn't static, it wasn't chatter. It was a clear, steady signal. A continuous, high-pitched hum. "Pilot, I've got something," he called out, his voice cracking with excitement. "It's strong. Dead steady. Right on, 31.5 megahertz." "Right," the pilot replied. "Let's see where it goes. Give me a direction." The radio operator tuned his directional antenna. It's strongest bearing 090, coming from the east, from Germany." The pilot banked the Anson, following the signal. For an hour they flew and the signal remained locked, a perfect, unwavering electronic line in the sky. It passed directly over the city of Derby, home to the Rolls-Royce engine factories, a critical war asset. The beam was aimed at it like a loaded gun. The operator logged the coordinates, the frequency, the signal strength. They had found it. Within hours, they'd found more. Another aircraft diverted to the area found a second set of beams. Each one was precisely aimed at a British industrial center. Jones, in his London office, took the call. He listened, his face pale as the data came in. He hung up the phone. It was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of confirmation, and it was terrifying. He had been right. The beams were real. Hitler's secret weapon was operational. And now, the real race was on. The race to figure out how to stop them before the Luftwaffe could use them to rain destruction on Britain. With proof of the beam's existence, the mood in Jones's department shifted from desperate hope to feverish, focused work. Jones and his team worked to understand exactly how the German system worked. They gave it a code name based on references they'd intercepted. Nickebein, the German word for crooked leg. The system, as Jones had theorized, was elegantly simple yet devastatingly effective. The Germans had built several powerful radio transmitters along the European coast, from Norway to France. Each transmitted a narrow beam, like a searchlight of radio waves using a specially designed antenna array. But the genius was in how the beams encoded directional information. Jones and Charles Frank hunched over an oscilloscope, analyzing the signal captured by the Anson. "Look at this," Jones explained, pointing at the wavering green line on the oscilloscope's screen. "The beam isn't uniform. It's not just a simple tone. The Germans have split it." He sketched it out. They're transmitting from two slightly offset antennas. On the left side of the beam's center, the aircraft hears Morse code dots. On the other side, it hears Morse code dashes, a da-da-da sound. He drew a central line, but if the pilot flies exactly in the center, the dots and dashes overlap perfectly. They interlock, and what do you get? "A continuous tone," Frank said, the admiration clear in his voice. "A steady hum." "Exactly," Jones replied. "It's like audio guardrails. As long as the pilot hears that steady tone, he knows he's flying straight along the beam directly to the target. If he hears dits, he steers right. If he hears daws, he steers left. He just follows the hum." Frank studied the data with growing admiration and dread. It was brilliant. Simple enough for any pilot to use, but accurate to within a few hundred yards over hundreds of miles. Understanding the system was only half the battle. Now they needed to stop it. The military's first instinct was to jam it, to broadcast a loud, powerful, crude signal to drown out the German beam. Jones argued passionately against it. "We can't just jam the beams directly," he explained to Air Marshal Dowding. "That would be too obvious. The moment we do it, the Germans will know we found them. They'll switch frequencies, or they'll change the encoding. We'll be blind again. The countermeasure has to be as subtle as the weapon itself. We can't let them know we're on to them. We need to confuse them, not deafen them." "What are you proposing, Dr. Jones? What is the counter to this conversation?" Dowding asked. "Deception?" "In a way," Jones replied. "We'll transmit our own signals on the same frequency, but we won't blast them. We'll transmit our own dash signals into the dot side of their beam, and dot signals into their dash side. We'll subtly bend the beam, or make the on-course signal seem wide and mushy. To the German pilots, it will seem like their equipment is malfunctioning. They'll drift off course without knowing it, but they won't immediately know why." It was a strategy of deception rather than brute force, a strategy of electronic manipulation. Dowding, a man who was beginning to trust the physicist, nodded slowly. "Do it." The British began setting up their own transmitters, codenamed aspirins because they gave the Germans a headache. They were carefully positioned to interfere with the German beams without making the interference obvious. Jones's team called the strategy meekening, leading the enemy astray with false signals. This battle would not be fought with bullets and bombs, but with radio waves and ingenious deception.
The first real test came on a cloudy, moonless night in June 1940. Intelligence reported that a German raid guided by Knickerbein was forming up. Their radio beams were aimed at a critical munitions factory deep in the Midlands. In a small, cramped bunker in southern England, RV, Jones and his team stood by their newly built transmitters. The air was electric with tension. This was it. The theory was about to face the ultimate test of combat. They're on the beam. A radio operator announced, his ears glued to the German bomber frequencies. I can hear the Knickerbein signal. It's clear. He was listening to the steady, guiding hum that the German pilots were following. All right, Jones said, his voice tight with anticipation. Activate the aspirin transmitter. Phase 1. Let's just send them some dashes. The British transmitter hummed to life. Miles away, high above the clouds, a German pilot had been listening to a perfect, steady tone in his headphones. Suddenly, a new sound bled through. Da, da, da. He was confused. He checked his instruments. Everything showed he was on course, but the signal was now telling him he was steering left. He corrected, steering the bomber to the right. Back in the bunker, Jones gave the next command. Now add the dots. Another signal shot out from the English coast. The German pilot, having just corrected his course, now heard a different interference. Dit. He was getting conflicting information. The pure, sharp hum that was supposed to guide him to his target was gone. It had been replaced by a garbled, confusing mush of dots and dashes. He swore at his radio operator, who swore back at his equipment. It had to be a malfunction. They were flying blind, uncertain of their position. The squadron leader made a guess. They dropped their bombs where they thought the target should be. In his office, Jones waited, listening to the reports as they trickled in. The raid was over. The bombs had fallen 5 miles off target in an empty field. There was no damage to the factory, no casualties. The bombers had missed completely. In the bunker, Jones and his team finally allowed themselves a small, exhausted cheer. It had worked, but this was just the beginning. The invisible war of beams and countermeasures was about to escalate dramatically. The Germans were not stupid. They had more sophisticated systems in development, and Jones's discovery of Knickerbein was about to lead him to something far more alarming. Just as British countermeasures began to systematically neutralize Knickerbein, Jones, sifting through a new batch of decoded messages, found something that made his blood run cold. The Germans, anticipating the failure of their first system, were already preparing its successor. The decoded messages referenced a new system, a name Jones had seen before but hadn't understood. Xskirt, the X device, and this one was different. Unlike Knickerbein's simple, pilot-guided audio beam, Xskirt was a complex, multi-beam, automated system. It was so secret that it was reserved only for high-value objectives that absolutely had to be destroyed and used by only the most elite Luftwaffe units, the specialists of Kampfgruppe 100, as Jones pieced together the fragments of intelligence. The picture that emerged was terrifying. He rushed to the Air Ministry to explain his findings to his superiors. The skepticism they once had was gone. Now, they were deeply afraid. It's automated. Jones explained, his diagram on the blackboard far more complex this time. The pilot doesn't even decide when to drop the bombs. He described how it worked. A German bomber would fly along a main guide beam, but then it would cross 3 additional crossbeams at precise intervals before the target. These beams were named after rivers: Rhine, Oder, and Elbe. The first crossbeam, Rhine, tells the pilot to prepare. Jones detailed, it's a 30-kilometer warning. The second crossbeam, Oder, starts a special stopwatch on the bomb aimer's console. When the aircraft crosses the third beam, Elbe, it stops the clock. The hardware on the plane then instantly calculates the bomber's ground speed based on the time it took to fly between the Oder and Elbe beams. The clock then automatically starts counting forward again, calculating the exact moment to release the bombs. The bomb aimer just watches the needle and waits for the automatic release. My God, whispered Henry Tizard, one of the leading scientists. It takes human error completely out of the equation. What is the accuracy? Jones's reply was grim. We estimate it's accurate to within tens of yards, not hundreds, tens. And it's much harder to jam. The team faced a new, desperate challenge. They had to locate the X-Gert transmitters, figure out their exact frequencies, and develop entirely new countermeasures, all while the system was already operational and aimed at Britain's heart. Working with barely any sleep, Jones and his colleagues analyzed every scrap of intelligence. They studied new crashed German aircraft. They coordinated with interrogators of captured Kampfgruppe 100 pilots. They monitored radio frequencies obsessively, searching for these new, elusive signals. Slowly, painfully, they pieced together how X-Gert worked. But they were still missing the key, the exact technical specifications needed to build a countermeasure. They were in a race against time, and the clock was ticking.
The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A German technical manual. A Kampfgruppe 100 bomber, hit by anti-aircraft fire, had crash-landed. The crew survived and was captured, but in their haste, they had carelessly left a manual in the wreckage. It contained partial specifications for the X-Gert receivers. It wasn't the full blueprint, but it was enough. It gave Jones the frequency bands, the filter settings. With this information, Jones could calculate the likely transmission frequencies the system used. We need to find these beams now, Jones told his team urgently. X-Gert is operational, and we know the Germans are planning something big. We just don't know where or when. RAF aircraft, now fitted with even more specialized receivers, began systematic searches, focusing on the new frequencies identified from the captured manual. On September 10, 1940, they found them. X-Gert beams, originating from transmitter stations in France, converging over southern England. By tracking these beams day after day, and by monitoring German communications, British intelligence began to do the impossible. They could see where the beams were aimed. They began predicting bombing targets, sometimes days before the raids occurred. It was an intelligence coup of staggering proportions, but it created an agonizing moral dilemma. Jones, now a regular attendee at the highest level strategy meetings, found himself in a new kind of hell. If the British evacuated cities before raids or moved defenses too obviously, the Germans would realize their most secret system was compromised. They would scrap it and move to something new, and the British would be blind again. But if they did nothing, people would die. Jones sat in meetings where commanders, grim-faced, had to make the decision. Save lives now and lose the intelligence advantage, or accept civilian casualties to maintain the deception. These were decisions number 28-year-old physicist should have to participate in. He was a scientist, a man of logic and numbers. But this was total war, and those numbers now had faces. Jones's discoveries had thrust him into the very center of Britain's most desperate secret struggle. The burden was crushing him, and the worst was yet to come. November 12, 1940. Jones, pale and exhausted, sat in an emergency meeting at the Air Ministry. The room was thick with a new, palpable fear. Intelligence had decoded German signals indicating a massive raid was planned for the night of November 14th. The code name was Operation Mondscheinsonett, Moonlight Sonata, and the X-Gurt beams were already being aligned. By tracking the beam intersections, British intelligence knew the target. It wasn't London. It was Coventry, a critical industrial city in the Midlands. A city packed with aircraft factories, engine plants, and munitions works. "We have 48 hours, Jones said, his voice strained from lack of sleep. "We know the frequencies. We can jam X-Gurt, but not perfectly. Not yet. We can evacuate the city. We can concentrate every fighter and anti-aircraft gun we have over the Midlands. But gentlemen, we need to decide. How much do we reveal of what we know? If we ace this, they will know. X-Gurt will be finished." The debate that followed was heated and painful. Some argued for full countermeasures. Jam every beam. Evacuate the city. Save Coventry. Others, from the intelligence services, insisted this would be a catastrophic mistake. It would reveal too much. They would be sacrificing the long-term war effort. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was briefed on the situation. The decision that emerged was a terrible compromise, born of impossible choices. They would deploy some countermeasures, but not all of them. They would attempt to jam the X-Gurt beams, but not with their full power. They would alert city authorities to prepare for a raid, but not order a mass forced evacuation that would signal specific foreknowledge. Jones felt sick. He understood the cold, brutal logic, but it meant people would die who might have been saved. This was the true cost of intelligence work. Sometimes knowing too much forced impossible, nightmarish choices.